At Crossroads, our mission and vision is to help people experience heaven on earth. And when I think about that, of course, it comes from the idea of Jesus teaching us to pray, where Jesus says, "Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven." But I also think about this as if the church exists to be a revelation of God's nearness to the world. That God is not distant, God is not far off in heaven, but that God is active in our world. And sometimes the best way we can help people see God's nearness is to help people experience and receive dignity. And oftentimes that's something that's at the core of what we're thinking about what we're doing. I think about some of the stories that Pastor Randy has about being in downtown Baltimore. And sometimes just the best work of evangelism, the first step you could do is by helping people experience dignity. I think about how we have a couple of ladies in Bangladesh right now meeting people at child development centers. They went over there bringing blankets to help the church gather when it's cold, but they also partnered with our sewing ministry here in the church and brought 75 dresses to help clothe little girls in a child development center that's there as well. These are little ways, little moments in which we're trying to help people experience heaven on earth. Not in fullness, we can't just call heaven down and make this heaven, but in little foretastes, little moments where people can experience just a sense of God's nearness and God's help. It's so good to be a part of a church community, I think, that's doing this work locally and globally as well. Now, in this series, it ties to this series because we've been talking about shame and about how we carry shame. And I think also that this vision that we have of heaven on earth isn't just about spreading it out there, but also experiencing it for ourselves. I don't want to be the kind of church where we have a whole bunch of people busy doing the work of Jesus without experiencing Jesus ourselves. And Jesus can do a radical work even in our lives, if we've been the kind of people who have gone to church our entire life and known the story of Jesus our entire life, there can still be places and moments in our hearts, in our inner life, in our story, where we could still use the grace of Jesus to absolutely set us free. And sometimes that might be a sense of dignity in our own life as well, especially if we think of dignity as the opposite or an antidote to shame. And I've heard a lot of people talking throughout this series that they do indeed carry shame, that they can understand with their head that Jesus forgives and sets free, but it still can be difficult to own that and to let shame from the past go. And so today I want to talk a little bit about shame as we close this out. And one of the ways that we try to erase our shame by playing a social game, seeing if there's ways in which we can accumulate wealth or status. And maybe if we just get bigger and better and badder in the world's view, then maybe my shame will go away. But I think that's a hollow game. And I think, again, the best antidote to our shame is to truly let Jesus meet us and reign in our heart and our life. Now, one of the ways in which I experienced shame as a kid, although I'm afraid this is going to sound silly to you, but it's true. My dad was in the military, so I moved constantly. And I was always the new kid. And I was always the new kid, but also we didn't have a lot of money. So I was always the new kid and the poor kid. And so at one point in my childhood, I went to 5 different schools in 7 years. 5 different schools in 7 years, always showing up in less than the coolest clothes and less than the coolest shoes, trying to start over, trying to make new friends, trying to fit in, trying to have a likable personality, trying not to be, too smart so that I couldn't fit in or too poor so I couldn't fit in on the other side, always trying to find my place. 5 schools in 7 years. And of course, there's a famous movie called Mean Girls that kind of shows this feeling of walking as a new kid, into the lunchroom. And this picture is just a quick screenshot from that movie. But I saw this the first time and I thought, oh my gosh, I know that. Still to this day, I am 42 years old. I should be okay. I should be completely secure in myself. I still walk into a lunchroom that I don't know, and I feel this little freak out in the pit of my stomach. Who am I going to sit next to? Who is someone that'd be interesting to me? Who's someone that wouldn't kick me out? If I sat down at that table right there, would they be like, whoa, that seat is saved. Go find somewhere else. Still to this day, I have this weird childhood shame and trauma in my own gut every time I walk into a lunchroom. It's terrible. The other moment as a kid in school as well was trying to figure out on the first day of school, whether you do or not, what seat to sit in. And so this was really a moment of shame and honor. If you walked into a class and this is what you saw, it's kind of nerve-wracking to be the first one to sit down. Do you remember this? What if all of the nerds sit next to me? Some people have sorted out their middle life better than others. See, it's good. What if one of my friends is in this class and I don't know it, and they come in later and they sit across the room? Picking a seat as the first person to pick a seat can be anxiety riddling. And I'm going to talk about picking a seat in the story that Jesus gives us here in just a moment, but I'm going to talk about a couple of other moments as well. For example, I don't really know what goes on in the women's restroom, but I can tell you there's a little bit of anxiety in the men's restroom. If you've never been in a men's restroom before, if there's a bank of urinals, there is a system as to where you are allowed to go or not go. Ladies, if you think I'm crazy, just turn to the nearest man. He's shaking his head. He knows. And you cannot stand next to another dude who is using the restroom. And there should always be an odd amount of urinals in a public restroom. I look at this and I think, there's only 3 usable urinals in this situation. Why have they even bothered with the extras? And if they put another one in, at least there could be a 4th one to use. But worst of all, there's a whole system, I'm telling you, but if you walk in and there's already 3 dudes using the restroom, you have a choice. Either you hold it, or you shame yourself publicly by stepping between 2 other dudes. Do not be that guy, is what I'm saying. Do not be that guy. It may be weird in the restroom, but when you walk out and you see that person again, And then you may have gone to a public setting before where you're at someone else's house, you've been invited to dinner, and there's no assigned seats. Where do you sit when it's not your own kitchen? When other people, other families are there, it's not just you and them. Where do you sit at the table? And this may be an easy solution if you've come as a couple. At least you'll sit next to the person that you've come with. I assume that's a good thing for your situation. You never know. But if you're not with anyone, you don't want to offend the other couples, you don't want to mess up the vibe that the host has set up, where do you sit? And where you sit can really end up affecting the whole night for you. If you sit next to someone that can only talk about their doctor's appointments, if you sit next to someone who only talks about their accomplishments, or only talks about their children, or, God forbid, only talks about politics, you could be in for a really long night. And yet, on the other hand, if you get sat next to the person who's cool, who's been everywhere, who's done everything, whose stories are funny and engaging, you can end up having an incredible night. 2 people could go to the same party and sit at the same table and have 2 entirely different experiences as to whether or not the party was good. Now, all of these things, to some degree or another, are a little bit of a setup for the story in which we're going to read today in the Gospel of Luke. And before we get there, we're going to turn to Luke 14. You can turn there if you'd like to. I want to talk a little bit about a problem that I think a lot of us have that is a part of a potential way of reading into the story that Jesus gives us today. And this is this idea of imposter syndrome. Have you ever heard of this before, imposter syndrome? The definition basically goes like this. It's a condition of feeling anxious and not experiencing success internally, despite being high-performing in external objective ways. Imposter syndrome is basically walking into a room and saying, I don't belong here. And then having people come and tell you how great you are and thinking, no, I know the real truth. I am not that great. And then they might even be platforming you or giving you a microphone or introducing you to someone important. And you thinking, oh my goodness, they think I have something to say or that I'm interesting or that I'm accomplished. And I am not. You may be standing in front of people talking as if you're an expert and thinking to yourself, I can't even put my clothes away at night. I can't even make my bed in the morning. I'm not even that kind to the people around me. All these sort of stories that we tell ourselves internally versus what people are saying about us externally. Imposter syndrome is thinking that you know a truth about yourself that invalidates you, that undercuts you. When everyone else around you is glad that you're there, but you yourself think, if they only knew the truth about me, they wouldn't be saying this. Now, I talk about this because I think we oftentimes, when it comes to shame, have this internal imposter syndrome about ourselves. No matter what it is that Jesus says about us, no matter what it is our spouse says about us, no matter what it is our neighbors say about us, we think within ourselves, if only they knew the truth about me, if only they knew what I had done, if only they had knew what mistakes I had made, if only they knew what struggles I have, then I would be shunned, I'd be put behind, I wouldn't be accepted, I wouldn't be appropriate, right? This is often what shame can create within us, within our own spiritual life. But here's the thing, there's a lot of ways for us to deal with that. One is to ignore it. Two is to just let the negative stories reign, that we eventually believe that about ourselves. Or three, we can hand it to someone else and let our debt be paid. Let our past be erased. And I think the best place to hand that is Jesus. But the story we're going to read in Luke today is about this sort of game of trying to buddy up to people who are better than us to hide our shame. To play this sort of social game that if we have shame, maybe we can hide it by hanging out with richer people than us. If we have shame, maybe we can hang out with cooler people. If the cooler people accept us, then we'll look cool. Maybe if we have shame, maybe we can cozy up to powerful people and borrow some of their power, and then we'll look powerful and people won't notice our shame. There was this game in the ancient world that they would play that Jesus confronts in this story. In particular, the host would sit at the head of the table, and the closer you sat to the host, the more honor you had, and the further you sat from the host, the more shame you had. Now, if this was the best party in town, sitting at the end of the table far from the host is better than not getting invited at all. But if you were in the best party in town with the best host in town and you sat right next to them, you pulled their honor into your own life. You borrowed their honor. If you weren't invited to the party or you sat all the way at the end of the table, you did not borrow their honor, but you received what leftover shame they might have. And so Jesus observes this party that he's invited to at a rich and powerful Pharisee's house, and just as soon as someone comes in and says the dinner is ready, everyone scurries to borrow the honor of the host so that they could become more powerful and seen as better by the people around them. It was like a game of like one of those teen games, right, where everyone moves chairs and tries to resituate themselves in the best position. And so we're going to read this story, Luke chapter 14, verses 1 through 24, and watch how Jesus confronts these games that we play to gain honor and to ignore shame. Would you stand with me as we read the text today? Starting with verse 1. One Sabbath, when Jesus went to eat in the house of a prominent Pharisee, he was being carefully watched. There in front of him was a man suffering from an abnormal swelling of his body. Jesus asked the Pharisees and the experts in the law, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not?" But they remained silent. So, taking hold of the man, he healed him and sent him on his way. Then he asked them, "If one of you has a child or an ox that falls into the well on the Sabbath day, will you not immediately pull it out?" And they said nothing. When he noticed how the guests picked the places of honor at the table, he told them this parable. When someone invites you to a wedding feast, do not take the place of honor, for a person more distinguished than you may have been invited. If so, the host who invited both of you will come to you and say, "Give this person your seat." Then, humiliated, you will have to take the least important place. But when you are invited, take the lowest placed, so that when your host comes, he will say to you, "Friend, move up to a better place." Then you will be honored in the presence of all the other guests. For all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. Then Jesus said to the host, "When you give a luncheon or dinner, do not invite your friends, your brothers or sisters, your relatives, or your rich neighbors. If you do, they may invite you back, and so you will be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed. Although they cannot repay you, you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous." When one of those at the table heard this, he said to Jesus, "Blessed is the one who eats at the feast in the kingdom of God." Jesus replied, "A certain man was preparing a great banquet and invited many guests. At the time of the banquet, he sent his servant to tell those who had been invited, 'Come, for everything is now ready.' But they all alike began to make excuses. The first said, 'I've just bought a field and must go to see it. Please excuse me.' Another said, 'I've just bought 5 yoke of oxen and I'm on my way to try them out. Please excuse me.' Still another said, 'I just got married, so I can't come.' The servant came back and reported this to his master. Then the owner of the house became angry and ordered his servant, 'Go out quickly into the streets and alleys of the town and bring in the poor, the cripple, the blind, and the lame.' 'Sir,' the servant said, 'what you ordered has been done, but there is still room.' Then the master told his servant, 'Go out to the roads and the country lanes and compel them to come in, so that my house will be full. I tell you, not one of those who were invited will get a taste of my banquet.'" This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You may be seated. The story begins with a man who has what we might call dropsy. It is a swelling of the body. There's medical science behind this now, but often the body can just swell with fluids, more than it can handle or expel on its own. And this man is sitting at or outside of the banquet, and Jesus sees him, and he knows that fundamental to the Pharisees' belief system is that you can do absolutely zero, no, none, nada work on the Sabbath day. And so, this is a day of worship and of rest, and so they would be against even healing on the Sabbath. And so Jesus begins to confront them about what it is that they believe. He says, "Is it legal to heal on the Sabbath?" And he's answered with silence because he knows and they know the answer is no, but at the same time, they see the situation in front of them and know that this would be unkind. To just let a man who could be healed continue in his suffering, continue in his illness, when Jesus is there and could heal him. And so a lot of times I think when we read the stories of the Pharisees, I think we find that it's really easy to agree with Jesus because that's how we're taught to read. That's what we're taught. Jesus is right, therefore it's always easy for us to agree with Jesus. And rightfully so, you should agree with Jesus. But a lot of times our automatic agreeing with Jesus doesn't allow us to see that the Pharisees are actually trying to bring about good. They were obsessed with keeping God's law, and in a vacuum, that's not necessarily a bad thing. And so this initial story into this text is a deciding between two goods: radically keeping God's law and healing someone who is ill. I think we can all agree that both of those are good things. But the struggle comes when these two good things come into competition with each other. Not every choice is a choice between good and bad. This is two good things. The Pharisees want to keep God's law rigidly and perfectly, and Jesus wants to heal this person. The Pharisees were not against Jesus healing him. They just were against him breaking the Sabbath, in their opinion. But Jesus is always teaching that the Sabbath is to bring about good. So he reaches down to this man with dropsy and he heals him, and the man goes on his way. And still there's no conversation. The Pharisees will not interject because they know they have a losing hand here. And so the story then transitions from Jesus healing someone who lacks honor, who has shame, and the shame is public. They're publicly unhealthy, and Jesus heals them and sends them on their way. The story transitions to a party, to table manners. Have you ever gone to a party before and just sat back and watched the party? I don't do this very often because I like talking to people. But I understand that there are people who are people watchers, who the idea of going to a party isn't their favorite thing. They don't want to talk to 100 people. They don't want to get to know everyone. They don't want to sit next to everyone, but they just watch it. And my understanding is that it is a wild thing to watch. That everyone seems to try to be getting to the coolest people, to rub elbows with the most powerful people, the people who have charisma, the people who are interesting. You want to be caught in the proper social situations, in the proper social circles. And Jesus seems to be in this story, hanging back and watching all of the people scurry. And he sees people trying to gain honor socially by who it is they sit by and who it is that they associate with. And while this is reading into the text just a little bit, I do think that oftentimes this is how we try to deal with our shame. We haven't figured out how to sort it within our own heart, within our own story. When the nights get quiet and the room gets dark, our shame sits there and it weighs on us. And we don't know how to get rid of it, so we do external things as if we can be in with the cool crowd, then maybe people won't notice my shame. If I can dress in more expensive clothes, maybe people won't notice my shame. If I can drive a nicer car, then maybe people won't notice my shame. If I can buy the biggest house, then people will think I'm honorable and won't know the truth of my shame. If I have the coolest friends, if I work at the greatest firm, if I have the biggest paycheck. And so we do all of these external things, thinking that we'll look honorable, we'll look cool, we'll look suave, we'll look rich, we'll look powerful, we'll look like we have influence, we'll look like we have charisma. And if we can build this life that looks good to other people, then they won't see my shame. They won't see the truth. They won't know what I'm dealing with on the inside. And we do all of this scurrying, all of this working. We'll run ourselves ragged, trying to hide to the world the truth of our inner life. And in so many ways, in a different social setting than the world we live in, that's what people are trying to do here. They're scurrying and they're moving for seats of favor, relationships of favor, and trying to gain honor so that they won't get shamed. It's a game we play where we assume if we can acquire the external, we can hide what's on the inside. Jesus calls this out, and he points out to everyone that this is a hollow sham. Just simply sitting in the best seats is not going to make you honorable, and it's not going to reduce or remove your shame. It's a temporary solution. And so he suggests instead, why don't you just dishonor yourself? Because then maybe people will honor you publicly. Choose places and people and friends of dishonor. Because even if you look silly in this world, he says, there will be a day where the resurrection will come, I will return, and you will then be honored. It's good advice. Someone jumps in with what I like to think of as a Jesus juke. Do you know people who do the Jesus juke? Like, for example, you might say to a friend, like that really, really hyper spiritual friend, man, I can't believe I spent all Saturday binge watching that show. And their response is something like, yeah, you could have spent that praying. You know that friend? Or you might say, oh man, I've been shopping for gifts for Christmas to give my kids, and it's possible that they might say, well, you know, Santa Claus didn't die for anyone. Jesus did. You know, have you met this person that Jesus jukes? And it kind of feels like that to me in this moment. Jesus gives this teaching and someone says, hey, blessed is the one who will eat at the feast in the kingdom of God. Yeah, that's the right answer. It's like being in Sunday school and someone asks you an Old Testament question. You just say Moses, because Moses is always the right answer. Right? You remember that when you were a kid? If it was the New Testament, Jesus was always the right answer. If it was the Old Testament, Moses was always the right answer. It was like answering C on the SAT. It's probably right. So he changes the subject, and Jesus just goes with it. He just leans in, and he says, yeah, the kingdom, the end times, the final banquet. He says, it's going to be like this. I'm going to go and invite everyone I know. And it's going to turn up that people have excuses, even for the heavenly kingdom. And you think, well, no, who would have excuses at the resurrection? When Jesus sets the table for everyone, and we can spend eternity with him, who would have excuses? And Jesus starts pointing them out. I've got work to do. I've got new toys to play with. I've got a brand new marriage. And then you begin to think, oh, yeah, we can have excuses, can't we? And so then Jesus says, go and invite people who've got issues. Invite people who are blind, people who are lame, people who are crippled, people who are struggling, people whose bodies are broken, people who have shame, people who have past, people who have histories, people who have illnesses. Invite them all. And those people start coming. But even then, the room isn't filled up, and Jesus says, go invite everyone. Give them the best invitation you possibly can. And the bottom line seems to be that when it comes to Jesus' table that he's inviting us to, it's not about whether or not you're worthy to be there. It's not about whether or not you have a past or a history. It's not about whether or not you have shame in your inner life or you wear shame on your external life. It's not about any of that at all. It's about whether or not you actually want to be there. When all of the options are laid before you, do you actually want to sit at the table with Jesus? And this may seem like some kind of a trick question, but it's not. It's as simple as that. Whatever shame you have, whatever past you have, whatever illness you have, whatever brokenness you have, whatever hurt you have, whatever struggle, whatever fear, whatever history, whatever story you have, it does not invalidate you at the kingdom of God. The question is, do you want to be there or do you have better things to do? And it truly is as simple as that. So what we find in the end of this story is that many of us have excuses when the rubber meets the road. And excuses are deadly things. Because those with excuses miss what Jesus is doing. So this whole series has been about shame. It's about the inner life that we have, the histories, the stories, the past that embarrasses us, that we're afraid actually defines us. And so in concluding this, I ask you, where else will you go with your shame? Shame makes you feel like you're excluded, like you don't belong, like you have imposter syndrome. You hold on to your past too long, and it's going to start defining you. But Jesus tells us over and over in parable after parable, story after story, that you are not defined by your shame in the kingdom of God. You are defined by what Jesus has done to cover your shame, to erase your shame, to remove your shame as far as the east is from the west. If you're holding on to shame, Jesus says you don't have to anymore. So I ask you, where will you go with your shame? If you keep playing society's games, hiding it with wealth and power and friendship and busyness and things to do, you will miss the kingdom that Jesus has prepared for you. We can excuse our way out of what God has for us. Whereas what Jesus is saying to us is, it is simple. Give it to me, and I will defeat it. I'll erase it. I'll remove it. It will not define you. All you have to do to sit at the kingdom banquet of Jesus is to want to be there. You are not excluded by the blooper reel that you play in your head when the world goes quiet and no one is watching. You are not defined by that. You are defined by a Jesus who is crucified and resurrected on your behalf to remove your sin and shame, your past and your history, and to set you free on a new trajectory of eternal life at a banquet in which you will be an honored guest. And all you need to do is to want to be there. And so I invite you just to receive these three things as we close today. First, I want you to understand that you are invited as a privileged guest at Jesus' table. It doesn't matter if you have physical limitations, if you feel like a loser in this world. It doesn't matter what your past is. It doesn't matter what mistakes you made. You are invited as a privileged guest at Jesus' table. I want you to understand that your burdens, your shame, and your past do not exclude you from God's redeeming work. The story of Jesus is that through his crucifixion and resurrection, you are forgiven. Simple as that. And then finally, in this text as well is a reminder that we're called to invite others, specifically and especially those who are down on their luck, those who are ill, those who are shameful, and those who are despised in our world. We're especially invited to say, there is room for you at the kingdom table, the feast that Jesus has for us. So as we go today, as we close, I want you to think about these things. It may be personal for you to have your shame removed, but it also may be someone that you know who is absolutely wrecked by guilt and shame. It is our call in this text to find and identify them and let them know that there is freedom in Jesus. And so you may think, I've kind of got this sin and shame thing beat. I know that Jesus has forgiven me. It may be personal. It may not be personal for you. Your moment may have come. If that's you, find someone who is struggling and invite them to understand how radically Jesus can save them. If, however, you are the one who are still struggling, please don't leave today without coming face to face with Jesus and asking him to remove your sin and your shame. He can set you free and make you new. We're going to sing a final song, and I want to invite you to stand. If you'd like to come and pray, the altar is open, as it always is. But it's especially open today as we close out this series. Don't let your shame define you. Leave it at the altar and let Jesus do the work of setting you free.